Okay, let's do it. Let's talk a little bit about accountability. So I put out a video yesterday in which I spoke about how it's important that we make the decision now that we're not going to go along with things that infringe upon our own freedoms. And towards the end of that video, I mentioned something about how, at least to some degree, we are collectively responsible for the situation that we find ourselves in. And I said, you know what? Maybe I'll do another video where I'll talk more about that. So let's talk a little bit about that today. Um, when I make a comment like that, where I say, "Hey, we are responsible for what is happening to us," I am not trying to absolve the perpetrators of responsibility for what they've done, what they've carried out, what they continue to carry out, what they're planning to carry out through whatever comes next. That's not my point. My First and foremost, they're responsible for their actions. What I'm saying is we allow them to do it. We make ourselves easy targets. And then when things are perpetrated against us, we don't do anything about it. We don't demand accountability. Now, there are small groups of individuals who do. And there are plenty of people who jump up and down and scream for sure. But there are not enough people who actually demand accountability from the real perpetrators. What happens often is someone is blamed, and then people become to some degree placated because blame was placed somewhere. And I'll give you a couple examples of how extremely egregious events have happened that to some degree have set us on the arc of history that we still currently find ourselves. And no true accountability was ever demanded. All right. And one of those events would be the JFK assassination. So, I mean, 60 years ago, we had a sitting president assassinated. Everyone's seen the video. That video has been played so many times throughout history that it's almost as if the event took place like live in front of everybody. I mean, it didn't, but I think you get my point. Almost as if there was some sort of ritualistic meaning behind the assassination, which plenty of researchers have said, okay, that's exactly what it was. That's probably beyond the scope of this video. I tend to agree with that, though. So a president is assassinated. Almost no one today, and I don't remember exactly what the figures are. I've looked them up before, but the majority of Americans today, 60 years later, do not believe that Lee Harvey Oswald acted as a lone gunman in carrying out that event. But yeah, that's exactly what the Warren Commission found. So a formal official commission is held. They come up with a completely BS explanation, and that explanation is accepted. Not enough people demanded that a real investigation be done and that the real perpetrators be arrested and prosecuted. And 60 years later, we only have theories, now some of which I think have a lot of merit, but we still only have theories as to what exactly happened, right? Okay, so fast forward 40 years. What happens? Another event takes place, in September, the September event. And, I was a cadet at West Point when that happened, which means I was only, 50 miles away from New York City when the September event occurred. And again, a completely BS commission is held. It gives us an answer, which at this point, 20 plus years later, many Americans do not accept. But when I say Americans don't accept these findings, the problem is not enough Americans do anything about it. So just look back over the last 60 years, and there are plenty other events in American history that we could talk about, but let's just focus on those two. On the arc of history from the early 1960s until now. So we have an assassination that takes place in late 1963. We have the September event that happens in 2001. And then, roughly 20 years later, we have this event, which I don't think originated in China. I mean, I just don't think it originated in China. I think China was on board. I think they collaborated. I think this is a much bigger event. But I think that our own government and DOD, an organization that I used to be a part of and that I happily left, is, I think, the main player. I could be wrong on that. I mean, whatever's happened over the last couple of years is obviously a large operation with a lot of collaboration from different organizations, corporations, and national governments. My assumption is that the United States government, principally United States government agencies like DOD, are the heavy hitters. If that's not true and there are other heavier hitters, I don't know who they are, but I don't think it's China. I just think they collaborated. I think they collaborated heavily, but I still think I think they played a supporting role. But anyway, it's almost doesn't matter. It's kind of immaterial. Everyone was involved. It's not as important who's the primary player and who are the, secondary players. Anyway, but my point is that this has been going on for 3.5 years. And we have no accountability, like zero accountability over what was just done against our nation. And Americans are dead. How many Americans are dead? We don't even know. We have no idea. I mean, Americans died from the shots. Americans died from remdesivir. Americans died as a result of the lockdowns. Americans died, or maybe people who might have died anyway, because of their age, but they died alone in hospitals or in, nursing homes. They died alone without their family nearby because of the ridiculous policies that were in effect at the time. So atrocities have been committed against Americans. And yet, sure, Americans scream and jump up and down, but there's been zero accountability. Now, people will call out some names. Oh, yeah, they'll scream about, Fauci, or they'll scream about, the shots or this or that. Sure. But there's been zero accountability. And there's not going to be any accountability from the government because the government's part of it. And until we realize that as a country, as people, and as the states, there's been very little action from the states. Now, you did have some states who stood up against the atrocities, because that's just what they are, right? The atrocities of the federal government. In 2020 and 2021, you did have some states, but not a single state went far enough to protect its citizens from the federal government. Not a single state, not a single one. All 50 were complete and utter failures. Every single one of them. There were some that did some good things. They did not do enough good things. Not a single one. There's not a single good example of a state that came close to getting it right during COVID. You have a couple of states who got some things right and failed utterly at other things. So the people have got to realize what's going on, and they got to demand more from their local governments, and they have to demand more from their state governments, because it's not going to happen at the federal level. Why was the Warren Commission investigating the JFK assassination? Why was it just a complete BS commission? Well, I mean, because it was ordered by Lyndon B. Johnson. I mean, come on, I mean, listen, I'm not here to tell you exactly how the JFK assassination was pulled off. I mean, I've read plenty about it. I do find it, fascinating. It's a fascinating topic. I mean, it's very tragic, but it's still fascinating. But it's an extremely complex operation with a lot of people involved. But of course, people within the U.S. government were involved. I mean, come on. So essentially, you have the government investigating itself and its, crony helpers from other organizations, or I don't know, outside help, whatever. But they're never going to get to the bottom of it. They're going to create a facade, and the American people are going to buy it, because unfortunately, the American people tend to be very naive, speaking about all of us collectively, and then, fast forward to the big September event, same thing, right? Most people buy the official narrative, myself included. I bought it for 6 years until, roughly 2007. Serving in the army, going to Afghanistan, assuming that I was in Afghanistan fighting for God and country, right? Like, that's what I thought when I was over there on my first deployment. Anyway, the point being is that until we as America demand accountability, nothing's going to change. So right now, so there are people right now who are, you got to be careful for those who are fear mongers, because, they want the public to be terrorized. So we don't want to deal in fear. However, we have to be realistic about what might happen, because we've seen what they've done before, and they may ramp it up this time. So we don't want to deal in fear, but we also do not want to turn a blind eye to what may be coming up next. But we also have to ask ourselves, why does this keep happening? Because we don't demand accountability. So again, I'm not victim blaming. I'm not saying that the extremely evil people who have done this against us are not responsible. Of course they're responsible. They bear primary responsibility. What I'm saying is, we as a group, we don't do ourselves any favors by making ourselves easy targets, So maybe we should start demanding accountability, but real accountability. And you can't demand real accountability until you realize what's actually happening. Now, and I'm not even saying understand the full ins and outs of what happened with this op that was conducted over the last couple of years, because I think it's extremely complex and it's hard to know exactly who did what. But what we do know is that the official narrative of what was done is just a complete lie. I mean, it's just a complete lie. And so we can't allow the people who are doing this, namely the government, for lack of a better term, to lie about it. And when I say the government, it's bigger than just the U.S. government. These people in the U.S. government that are doing this are obviously taking their orders from someone who has an enormous amount of leverage over them. How is that done? I don't exactly know. Who are those people that are at the very top of this, this power pyramid? Listen, I don't pretend to know. But it's very clear that this exists. I mean, come on, it's been going on forever. There are too few people out there. There are too few Christians out there that actually believe in spiritual warfare. That's part of our problem. There are a lot of Christians out there that that say they believe in spiritual warfare, but I don't think they actually do, which they think they do, but they don't actually understand that we're in the midst of spiritual warfare right now. And they don't actually understand how spiritual warfare is carried out. Now, of course, this war that is first and foremost spiritual also is executed along other modalities as well. I mean, it's clearly very physical. I mean, there are people who physically die. I mean, it's very true, right? There are people who are economically destroyed. There are people who are psychologically injured. There are certainly people who are morally injured. So it exists along various modalities, but it is fundamentally a spiritual war. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people who say that they believe in spiritual warfare, they don't actually know what that means. And when you maybe present to them what may actually be happening in terms of spiritual warfare, they don't seem to get it. I mean, we don't live in a purely material world. I mean, I think it's bigger than that. And I think there's a lot going on. It's probably been going on for a very long time. And we have to be awake to that reality. I mean, it is what it is. This is the reality that we live in. And we can either be awake to it and we can try and fight, or we can turn a blind eye to it. And then how can we be surprised when we continue to be victimized? So in summation, we are to some degree responsible for what is happening to us, because at least collectively, and again, I'm not blaming everybody, because there are people who have fought tremendously, but collectively as Americans, we have allowed this to happen, and we're allowing this to continue to happen. So if you know you haven't really been engaged in the fight, then get engaged in the fight. And again, because this is fundamentally a spiritual war, things like fellowshipping with others, things like prayer, that stuff matters in a very real way, because that is a type of spiritual warfare. I think that's all I have to say today. I mean, obviously at other times we can talk more concretely about discrete actionable steps that can be taken when we talk about, demanding accountability. But for right now, I just kind of wanted to talk about just that concept of, hey, listen, we got to take some responsibility for what's happening. Sure, we scream about accountability, and people scream about, Nuremberg 2.0. People sure want to throw that term out there. I don't really like that term for two reasons. One, I think people have a narrow understanding of what Nuremberg was. Nuremberg itself was kind of a show. And I say that because I still think people have a limited understanding of what World War II was. So anyway, once people kind of start to expand their understanding of World War II and, look at what was going on both sides and try and expand their view of what happened during World War I to get to World War II, and who some of the big controllers were, and then what happened in the immediate aftermath of World War II, like Operation Paperclip. I think you have to realize that Nuremberg is not quite what people try to paint it up as. It was kind of for show. But the other reason that I don't really like the term, I know what people mean when they say Nuremberg 2.0. I get it. And of course, it's clearly a reference also to the Nuremberg Code. I get that. And the violations of the Nuremberg Code that are obviously happening all over the place. But the other reason I don't really like it is because I don't like talk with very little action. And I hear a lot of talk and I see very little action. So I'm just going to leave it there. So anyway, we'll talk more. Again, accountability. Let's continue to look for ways in which we can act and not just, allow ourselves to be victimized. Like I said last night, we cannot become agents of our own enslavement. So, all right, have a good one. We'll talk soon.